In ancient Israel, during a time of great famine and struggle, there was a man named Elijah. He was a prophet of God, a voice in the wilderness, and a leader during some of the toughest years the people of Israel had endured. Today, we're uncovering one of his most moving experiences, a lesson in faith, trust, and God's provision. You won't believe how it unfolded. This is the story of Elijah and the widow. Let's dive in. The land was dry, very dry, parched under the weight of a prolonged drought that left the inhabitants of Israel and its surroundings desperate for food and water. At God's command, Elijah had pronounced this drought upon the land because of the people's idolatry and their turning away from him. It was a wake-up call, a vivid reminder of who truly holds power over all creation. Now picture this. Elijah, who had been calling on God and being provided for supernaturally through ravens who brought him food by the brook, faced a new command from the Lord. The river had dried up, and God told Elijah to make his way to Zarephath, a city beyond Israel's borders in the land of Sidon. There, God had prepared someone surprising to help him, a widow in her direst moment of need. Elijah obeyed and traveled to Zarephath, a journey that must have been exhausting under the scorching sun and bleak conditions. As he approached the gates of the city, he saw her. The widow was gathering sticks, her movements slow and deliberate. Though she looked like any ordinary woman, her plight was far from normal. In deep poverty, she was a mother on her last thread of hope. Elijah called out to her, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so that I may drink?" Remember, water was precious in a time of drought, but she paused, willing to meet his basic need. Then, as she began to fetch the water, Elijah added another request, one that would test her to the core. "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." The widow stopped in her tracks. You could hear the desperation in her voice as she responded, "As surely as the Lord your God lives, I don't have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." This widow's statement was heartbreaking. She had resigned herself to hopelessness, preparing for what she thought would be her last meal. But Elijah, moved by a message from God, spoke words of faith that would change everything. "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." Imagine the tension in that moment. Could she trust a stranger who claimed to speak for God? Could she risk the little she had left on faith alone? But something stirred in her heart. She believed, and she obeyed. She went back home and did as Elijah instructed. And here's where the miracle happened. The jar of flour did not run out, and the jug of oil did not run dry. Every single day, there was just enough to sustain Elijah, the widow, and her son. God had provided exactly what they needed. This was not just a random act of kindness or an extraordinary coincidence. This was God fulfilling His word, proving His faithfulness even in dire circumstances. The widow's willingness to give in faith opened the door to abundance where there had once been scarcity. But the story doesn't end there. Sometime later, the widow's son became very ill. His sickness worsened until he stopped breathing. Overwhelmed with sorrow, the widow turned to Elijah, crying out, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Elijah, driven by compassion and divine purpose, took the boy from her arms and carried him to the upper room where he was staying. Laying the boy on his bed, Elijah cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" Then, In an act of profound faith, Elijah stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried again to the Lord, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." God heard Elijah's prayer, and the boy's life returned to him. He lived. Elijah carried the boy back to his mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." Filled with awe, the widow said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." This story of Elijah and the widow is one of remarkable trust and provision. It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, God is with us. He sees our needs, and His provision is always sufficient. Will you trust Him with what little you have today? Because you never know how He might multiply it in ways beyond your imagination.